Why is it when they always say this person doesn't need any introduction, but they go ahead and introduce them anyway? Why do they do that? I don't know. I just want to put one rumor to rest. You know how nasty rumors can be. You know how they can get carried away. But I just want to put one rumor to rest right now. Black is not slimming. It's a nasty rumor. It's not true, obviously. Look at this. It is not slimming. So now you can rest easy and know that that rumor has been proven false, and you can stop the ugly rumor that travels around that black is slimming. Anyway, how y'all doing? Good. We're doing our step number 2 tonight. We believe in a God who still works miracles today. How many of you have ever experienced a miracle? Wow, a lot of you. That's awesome. Praise God. Well, I talked to a gentleman this morning that is a part of our church family. His name is Roy Gillum, and he gave me permission to share his story just a little bit. He was at a Bucks game a few weeks ago. I think it was the last home season game, and they lost. Surprise. And so they were on their way home, but they were stuck in that game time traffic. You know that traffic that just, I don't know why they call it traffic, because nobody's moving. They're just parked right there in the street. And Roy apparently had a heart attack, and he just laid his head back on the headrest. He was driving. He laid his head back on the headrest, and his wife, Michelle, and his son, Blake, thought that he was just kind of taking a break because the traffic wasn't going anywhere. Well, then they realized that he wasn't responding to them when they were talking to him. And so he had a heart. They didn't know what was going on, but he had a heart attack. Not a good thing when you're driving. And fortunately, his foot stayed on the brake. And Michelle was able to reach over when they realized that something was wrong. She was able to reach over and put the car in park. So that was an amazing thing. And then Blake got out of the back seat, and they were close enough to the stadium that were still policemen on every corner just about. And he found a mounted police officer about a block or so up, and he told him what the situation was. And he was coming back with that police officer on his horse, and Blake wasn't on the horse, just the police officer. And by the time he got back, a lady that was 3 cars ahead of them was an EMT, ambulance person that was off duty. She realized something was going on. She got out of her car, and by the time Blake got back with the police officer, this lady had Roy laying out doing CPR, which later on they realized it saved his life. He was taken to the hospital, where the hospital's best heart doctor happened to be on call and was there at the hospital. And he was able to do some tests, and they put a stent in the artery that was 90% blocked. Now, when the patrol officer got his horse back to the stable, he knelt at the stable and prayed for Roy. And he called Michelle for a couple of days afterwards, just wanting to see how Roy was doing, wanting to get updates. And then another interesting thing that I just found out today is that the officer's horse, when they were there by Roy, the horse leaned down and licked Roy's forehead. Now my horse, I have a horse. My horse, if I was laying on the ground unconscious, my horse would say, "When you're done, I'm over here at the hay bale." My horse is like me. He doesn't believe black is slimming either. But this horse would, even after they pushed the horse back, the horse tried to come back and lick Roy's forehead. Of course, Roy doesn't remember any of that. And Michelle was telling me this story a few days after all of this had happened. And I said, "Michelle, do you realize how many miracles God brought to you in these moments?" They hadn't made it to the highway. They were headed to Brandon to go for dinner. And they hadn't made it to the highway where they would be doing a high rate of speed. They were parked. They were stopped in traffic. He was able to keep his foot on the brake while he was unconscious. Some of us can't even do that when we're awake. Michelle was immediately able to put the car in park. The police officer was close by so that he could call paramedics and direct traffic. The EMT was 3 cars ahead so that she could save his life. People that were gathering around asked Michelle what they could do. She said, "Just pray." And she said people were praying as they surrounded them right there on the sidewalk. They had the right doctor at the right hospital. He only needed one stent. He had a police officer praying for him. And of course, my favorite, the horse licking his forehead. Roy said that God had all the right people in all the right places. And he said none of this was a coincidence. It was all God. So sometimes we experience one miracle, but Roy and Michelle and Blake, they experienced several miracles within this episode. Theologian Wayne Grudem defines miracles this way. He says, a miracle is a less common kind of God's activity in which he arouses people's awe and wonder and bears witness to himself. Now that's a pretty good definition. It's theologically correct. It's really a good definition, but for my simple little mind, it seems to be, well, a little deep, a little wordy. I'm a simple kind of guy. So I came up with my own definition of a miracle. My definition of a miracle is, I need something that only God can provide. I need something that only God can provide. And I'm not taking anything away from Roy's miracle a couple of weeks ago, but sometimes I think we limit our thinking of miracles to just the healing of our bodies. In reality, I think we experience miracles more often than we think. You know, I have a lot of other needs that only God can provide. One thing I need is protection. I remember hearing my dad pray a lot. He said, protect us from dangers seen and unseen. Now, how many of us have stories of God's protection when we didn't even know until later that we needed his protection? You've got those stories. Yeah, you've experienced those. One of the first things that I did after Brooksy and I graduated from seminary, and we started at our first church there in Kansas as a youth pastor. When I found out she got a job, I went out and bought a motorcycle. Always wanted one. So I went out and bought a little Suzuki 550. And one of my favorite things to do was about 10 o'clock at night, because the church was out in the country. And back, in Kansas, it's flat. It's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there, kind of a thing. It's just flat, and everything is marked off in mile squares. So I would jump on my motorcycle about 10 o'clock at night, go for a quick ride, and I knew it wasn't very busy. The two-lane country roads weren't busy, but they were square, and every mile there was a stop sign. So between stop signs, I would just open it up, and I'd be going 85 or 90 miles an hour, just having the time of my life. Had full-face helmet on, hitting June bugs. Anybody know what a June bug is? They're about this big, and they only come out in June, fortunately. And when you hit one with your helmet going 80 miles an hour, it feels like somebody's throwing a rock at you. So I was pulling up to this stop sign, and I thought it was a familiar place, and I looked at the street sign, and I said, wait a minute. I went through the last stop sign a mile back, blew through that stop sign doing about 80 miles an hour. And I said, God, thank you for protecting me when I didn't even know I needed protection. Do you think that was a miracle? I think it's a miracle that he would even let me live in that situation. I also need wisdom. Anybody else need wisdom? How about guidance? And I have experienced God's guidance and God's wisdom so many times. And that's a miracle, that he would share that wisdom, that he would share that guidance with me. What about the miracle of salvation? I needed to be saved. God is the only one that could save me. What about the miracle of grace? I need grace, and only God can give me the grace I need. I can't buy it. I can't earn it. I can't do anything. But God gives me something that I need. So let's take a few moments tonight and look at Jesus' first miracle in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And I find it really interesting that Jesus' first miracle is not one of healing, but it was a situation where there was a need, and only Jesus could provide for that need. I like to go through the scriptures. I'm one of those kind of guys that I like to know the background story. I like to know the situation. I like to know the history. I like to kind of delve into that and study the culture and those kinds of things that surround the passage of Scripture. And so I'm going to kind of go through this passage very quickly, and then we'll get to some really important stuff. Verse 1, on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Now, in those days, weddings lasted more than just a few hours like ours do. You know, typically ours is we come in and we sit down and we look all pretty, and then the bride comes down with her dad, and it's about a 20-minute ceremony, and we can't wait to get through it because we're ready to go eat. We want some cake. We didn't come here for the wedding, we came for the cake. And in that culture, it was a week-long celebration. It wasn't just a matter of a few hours. The ceremony itself would take place in the evening following a big buffet. Now, I think that's funny because how many of you would stay awake for the wedding after being at the buffet all afternoon? There wouldn't be anybody awake for the wedding. Hopefully the bride and the groom were awake, but nobody else would be. And after the ceremony, the couple was paraded under canopy-covered streets on their way to their new home. They did that so everybody in the village could congratulate them and give them their best wishes. It would be dark by the time they would get around to going home so that they had people carrying torches to light their way. Now that newlyweds, they didn't go on a honeymoon. They stayed at home. They would have an open house for a week. And they were treated like a king and queen, and many times they wore crowns. Weddings were a big deal back then, a week-long celebration. Why? Why was it a big deal? Because in those days, life was hard. It was really hard. There was a lot of poverty. Many people didn't have jobs. They couldn't support their family. And so to take a week-long celebration was a welcome escape from the difficult days that they were experiencing. We go on. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Mary was there, but there was no mention of Joseph being there. And the best explanation that I can come up with, that being a man, and we men, we don't like to go to a wedding that isn't our own. So that may have been the reason. That was supposed to be funny. Just laugh at me, Craig, and just look at me and laugh. That's all I need for you to do. Don't even laugh at my jokes. Just look at me and laugh. I'm good with that. It's probable that Joseph died, and we know that Jesus was 12 when he was left behind in the synagogue, and he was 30 when he started his ministry. So there's a gap of about 18 years that suggests that Jesus may have supported his mother and his younger siblings until the younger ones got old enough to support their mother. So we have this incredibly happy occasion, and everyone's having a great time. Then a catastrophe strikes. Verse 3, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Now, Mary may have had a very special responsibility at the wedding feast. Maybe she was related to the bride or the groom, but we know that she had something to do with the feast because she mentioned that they were out of wine. Maybe she was the one that was kept track of how they were doing on the wine and the hors d'oeuvres and those kinds of things. And for a Jewish feast, wine was crucial. In fact, rabbis would say, without wine, there is no joy. Now, we would assume that everyone's getting drunk, right? But that wasn't the case in those days. In fact, drunkenness was actually a disgrace. So they drank their wine mixed with 2 parts wine and 3 parts water. So another reason running out of wine was a catastrophe was that hospitality was a sacred duty. And if the food or the wine ran out, the bride and groom would be humiliated. So Mary doesn't want this to happen to this young couple. And so she tells Jesus, they have no more wine. Verse 4, "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." Now, how many of you ever said to your mother, "Woman"? Okay, if I had said that to my mother, I wouldn't be alive today. Now, the translation is correct. The word really is woman, but it doesn't indicate the tone of which that word was said. To us, it really sounds like Jesus is being rude, but he's not. It's the same loving word that Jesus used when he was on the cross. He used the word woman in addressing his mother as he left her into the care of John, his beloved disciple. And then his response was, "My hour has not come." I'm wondering if Mary thought, what does that have to do with anything? We're out of wine. My hour has not come. Jesus always knew that he had come into this world to fulfill his Father's plans and purposes and not his own. All of his life, Jesus walked toward the cross, which was the reason why God sent him in the first place. Verse 3, his mother said to the servants, it's almost like she ignored what Jesus had to say. Mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So she had apparently enough authority to tell the servants what to do, the servants to do whatever Jesus told them to do. You see, Mary knew her son. She had lived with him for 30 years, and she had confidence in him that he would do what needed to be done. She didn't know what he was going to do. She didn't know how he was going to do it, but she had the faith and trust in him to do what was right, to do the right thing. Verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. The water was there because they didn't have paved roads back in those days, and when it was a dry season, their feet would get really dusty. If it had rained, their feet would be really muddy. So the water was there to wash their feet before they went into the home. And it also was there for the hands to be washed before each meal and between each course. And if their hands were not washed, they would technically become ceremonially unclean. So the water was there for a dual purpose, to wash your feet and to wash your hands to make sure that they're ceremonially clean. Verse 7, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Now John, who wrote this gospel, he felt like he had to tell us that the water jars were filled to the brim. That's an incredible detail that he gives us. They were filled to the brim to show that nothing but water had been put into the pots. There wasn't room for anything else. Only water was going to be in those pots. Verse 8, then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till last. It almost sounds like the head waiter, the maitre d', is kind of joking with the groom. Hey, buddy, you don't bring out the good stuff when everybody's taste buds are just kind of numb because of all the food and all the wine that they've already been drinking. No, we don't do that at this kind of party. It's not the normal procedure. So Jesus' first miracle was a miracle of creation. He changed the chemical composition of water and turned it into wine. Scientifically impossible, but not impossible with God. And look what, and then let's go on. Verse 11, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It was at a simple village girl's wedding that Jesus showed his glory. The first time he had showed his glory. And it was there that the disciples caught a glimpse of who and what Jesus really was. At this wedding, something was needed, and only God could provide. God continues to do miracles. Why? To show us that he is the real deal, that he wants to help. And then look what happened after the miracle. The disciples believed in him. He's still in the miracle-working business. He still wants us to see his glory. He wants to alleviate our suffering. But there's a catch to all of this. There's a catch to receiving a miracle from God, and that is we must be willing to ask. Look at Mary, the mother of Jesus. Look what she did. Number one, she acknowledged her need. In verse 3, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Mary knew that there was a need, and she didn't beat around the bush. She was very specific. She just said, they have no more wine. Here's the problem, Jesus. Here's the issue, Jesus. I'm not getting around. I'm not bringing in anything else. I'm not saying anything else. I just said, letting you know that there's no more wine. So she acknowledged her need. when we ask God, be specific. Don't beat around the bush. He knows what's in the bush. He knows what's all there. He just wants you to be specific as to what you need him to do. Secondly, she prepared to receive. Verse 5, his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. They had to get ready for what God was going to provide for them. It's coming. It's going to happen. Jesus is going to take care of this, so we better get ready. She didn't know the details, but she knew the one who did. Thirdly, she was confident that Jesus would do something. She says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Mary didn't waver in her confidence that her son would do something that was out of the ordinary. She totally trusted him. She didn't take a poll or a survey of what people might suggest that Jesus would do. You know, if you ask somebody what we should do about something, you ask 50 people, you get 50 different reasons. Mary didn't have to do that. She just knew that Jesus would do something, and she had confidence in him. Well, let's look at what Jesus did. He listened to his mother. Woman, why do you involve me? You know, it's not that disrespectful. It's that he loved her deeply, and he heard what she was asking of him, and he knew what he was going to do, but he also knew that it wasn't his time yet. But because he loved her, he listened to her. Because he loves you, when you ask, he will listen. Secondly, he used what they had, 6 stone water jars. Jesus had this amazing way of using what was available to teach, to preach, and to heal. In his parables, he often would point off to something that the people could see. Parable of the sower. There was a farmer out there throwing his seed, so he used that, drew their attention to that. See the farmer throwing out his seed, and then he brings them back and teaches them a spiritual truth about the Word of God. And then when he healed, remember what he did for one blind man? He picked up some dirt and spit in it, and then put it on the man's eyes, told him to go wash his eyes, and he could see again. So with his touch, with mud, and with spit came healing. He uses what they had. Now don't be surprised if God uses you, an old clay pot. Thanks, Craig. Don't be surprised if God uses you to provide a miracle for somebody else. God has given some of you some amazing resources, whatever it may be. Maybe it's great faith. Maybe it's time that you have to give people. Maybe it's a compassionate heart. Maybe it's a burden for somebody. Maybe it could be a listening ear. Maybe it could be your money. But if he can turn an old clay pot full of water into wine, he can do something with you to provide a miracle for somebody that's in need. Number 3, he honored her prayer. Jesus honored her prayer. He said, fill the jars with water. Because Mary simply asked, Jesus did something. Jesus will always do something when we ask him. You know that? He will always do it. No, maybe not the answer that we thought we wanted. It may not even be on our time, but when we ask something, Jesus doesn't ignore it. God doesn't ignore it. He doesn't say, I'll get back to you on that. What he does is he begins the process to provide for what you need. In my definition, that's a miracle. Number 4, I love this one. He gave them more than they ever imagined. He gave them more than they ever imagined. Now let's just assume that these 6 water pots would hold 30 gallons. I'm horrible at math. How many gallons is that? Wow, you guys are pretty bad at math too. How many gallons is that? Louis, you're the finance guy at the church. You should know the answer to this. 180, thank you. We have a consensus then. There's 180 gallons of wine. Folks, that's a lot of wine. That's a lot of wine. When the grace of Jesus comes, there's enough for everyone. No matter how great our need may be, we would never exhaust the grace of Jesus. His grace is more than sufficient for every need that we might have. There's an old hymn written by a lady named Annie Johnson Flint who went through some very difficult things in her life. Her mother died when she gave birth to her little sister, and her father had an incurable disease, and he died, and they willed them to a family that would take them to church, and not too long after that, that couple died, and then Annie developed, early on in her life, arthritis, and then was told at a very young age that she would be an invalid for the rest of her life. Well, she delved into her poetry and writing songs, and that's what got her through the difficult days in her life. And she said, through the process of her poetry, she became convinced that God intended to glorify himself through her weak earthen vessel. She claimed for herself the promise God made to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Now, when she died in 1932, she left behind a lot of poems and songs, but I think the song that she wrote, there isn't anything better. She wrote the song, "He giveth more grace." Listen to these words. "He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater." You think that's a miracle? That's a miracle. "He sendeth more strength when the labors increase." Another miracle. To added afflictions, he addeth his mercy. Isn't that something that you need that only God can give? To multiplied trials, his multiplied peace. Miracle after miracle after miracle. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. The best part is the chorus. His love has no limits. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. I don't know what kind of miracle that you need tonight, but I believe that God still works miracles today. And I believe that God is ready to do something in your life that only he can do. I have a need that only God can provide. If the band will come up, if y'all stand with me, please.